Thank you, and hello everybody from a rather cold and damp London. We are delighted to have the opportunity to deliver this plenary for this year's BBELT conference, and it's great to see so many people here. Firstly, I'm going to introduce our Future of English project, and Mina will then look at the implications for teachers. So, a bit of background to kick off. In 2006, the late, great linguist David Graddol produced his influential book, English Next, which was commissioned by the British Council, in which he examined the current and potential future trends in English language learning and teaching, following on from his earlier book, The Future of English, in 1997. Now, English Next has become our most cited publication, and it provoked a huge amount of debate on the learning and teaching of English. People regularly quote data from it, even though it's 17 years old now. And in 2001, our head of research and insight, Mike Solly, was asked to give a presentation to the Society of Pan English Language Teachers, or SPELT, conference. And he thought it would be interesting to review Graddol's predictions 15 years after English Next. Now, this review produced some very interesting ideas. So the British Council then decided to review Graddol's predictions more formally and to draft a new list of our own proposed trends for the future of English. And this became phase 1 of our project. In phase 2, we conducted regional roundtables across the world. And phase 3 has started now with research into various areas of the future of English, recently commissioned, and a book due out in April this year. And I'm going to discuss all of these phases in this talk. So how accurate is it possible to be when making predictions like Graddol's 10 to 15 years ahead? In phase 1 of our project, we looked at his predictions and how accurate we think they turned out to be. And it'll be interesting to see if you agree with us on these. Now, Graddol made 14 predictions about the future of English. First, he predicted an increase in the numbers of people learning English to around 2 billion, and then a fairly steep decline. Right? It's very difficult to put a definitive number on language learners worldwide, but there has definitely been a substantial rise in learner numbers, but no sign of a fall yet. As you'll see later, we predict that learner numbers will actually remain fairly steady for the foreseeable future. So he was certainly partially right there. He predicted a wider age range of learners and an increased range of needs for English. And this has happened. Courses for very young learners and specialist courses like English for aviation, for example, have become much more widely available. He predicted increased competition in teaching from markets where English is not the first language. And there is some evidence of this, particularly from Asia-based organizations. Although there have been recent law changes in China that effectively ban extra classes outside schools for kids. So that may well start to have an impact there. A decline in the private sector teenage and young adult market for EFL, and an ongoing decrease in the numbers of international degree students in English-speaking countries. Now, pre-COVID, there wasn't really any evidence of a decline in the market of teenage EFL students or international degree students, in the UK at least, although there may yet be more impact from Brexit and still possibly COVID here, and I'll touch on this again a little later. Graddol saw a move away from the so-called native speaker norm in English. Now, this idea that native speaker norms would be replaced by a more globalized concept of English hasn't really happened yet, but there are signs that this may be underway now beyond its conceptualization in academic research. It might have been the timing that Graddol wasn't quite right about. And again, we'll talk more about this one later. And he predicted a lack of opportunities for people who only speak English. But it's not really clear, not yet at least, that being monolingual is having much of an economic impact on English monoglots. So what else did Graddol predict? he's predicted significant growth in the use of languages other than English on the internet. Now, we have some quite recent data on this. If we look at the first language of internet users and how much those have increased over the last couple of decades, some languages have shown dramatic increase, notably Arabic here, Russian, Indonesian, Malay, and Chinese, but also Portuguese and Spanish to an extent. But that was from a very low starting point. So English is still the first language of about a quarter of internet users. Although notice that outside the top 10, other languages make up a further quarter. Now, it's not obvious from the graph, but around 50% of internet users are actually now based in Asia. And less than 10% of global users are based in Central and South America, and only about 16% in the Americas as a whole. But in terms of language content, the content of internet pages, English still dominates. It's used in just under 60% of all websites. And this data is just from a few days ago, so it's quite up to date. So we can say that Gradol was partially right in predicting a growth of other languages. He also predicted that there'd be a growth in the use of other languages for outsourced services such as call centers, for example. But again, it's not immediately apparent that other languages are having much of an impact of the dominance of English, either in resources or in economic advantage. Gradol thought that Asia would determine the long-term future of English as a global language. Now, while Asia hasn't yet played a major role in determining the future of global English, China and India in particular may well have significant influence on this in the coming years. Gradol thought that having English would no longer give you a competitive advantage, as so many people would be able to speak it. But speaking English does definitely still provide an advantage in many contexts, although there is growing interest in learning other languages in many places. The increase in English medium education, EME, also called EMI, was predicted to force English teachers to retrain to teach other subjects as well as English. And although more specialist qualifications have become available for English teachers, particularly at master's level, we haven't yet seen mass retraining to teach other subjects using EME. And finally, Gradol predicted a major shift away from the conventional model of English as a foreign language, where the ideal teacher is supposedly a native speaker and only English is used in the classroom. Now, the shift away from that EFL model, characterized by native speaker teachers and English-only classrooms, has definitely begun. There is an increased focus on the benefits of multilingualism and increasingly translanguaging in language learning and teaching. And it's beginning to slowly filter into some teacher training and professional development, although it is slow, I think. So it's not the end of traditional EFL yet, but it might be the beginning of the end. It's worth mentioning at this point, actually, that we use the term native speaker in this discussion as that it's the term Gradol used. It's a very contentious term, particularly when we say non-native speaker. I can't say it without putting quote marks with my fingers. But it is still very widely used, and the applied linguistics and EFL communities have yet to agree on a suitable alternative. And we'll talk more about this in our book due out in April this year, and we'll be giving you a reference for that later. So it seems that Gradol may have been right about the general direction of the learning and teaching of English. He felt that English's position as a truly global language was secure, but the perceived ownership of the language was changing from those who spoke it as a first language to everyone who speaks it, including the majority who speak it as a second or other language. Mind you, this is supposing, of course, that anybody or any group can own a language, which is another question. So, given the difficulties about making any predictions about future events, why did we decide to make another set of predictions about the English language for the next decade? Well, it's not really about getting it right. It's about starting a discussion. That's what Gradol did. And that's what we're aiming to do with this project. And we'll talk later about how you can help us with this. So after we analyzed Gradol's trends, we commissioned some research to help us develop our own 16 projected trends for the next decade or so. Now, these were presented in fairly random order. You can see them here, but rather than go through each in detail, I've grouped them into different topic areas to present them to you, so you don't have to read all this small writing. Some of these projected trends appear in more than one topic, and please bear in mind these are general global trends. They may well vary between countries and regions. Some may, in fact, be entirely invalid in some places, and you may feel that there are some possible trends that we haven't included here. So our first topic is the growth in English language learning. As we saw in the graph earlier, we predict that the number of English language learners will remain fairly steady over the next decade and not fall as Gradol predicted. There will be major growth in online learning, and of course the COVID epidemic has accelerated that considerably. Also, an ever-increasing range of more specific language programs, and studying in English-speaking countries like the UK or the US will remain an attractive option. Though again, here in the UK, the ongoing fallout from Brexit, and possibly in various places, fallout from COVID may yet continue to have an impact. While online learning will continue to increase, English will also continue to be taught as a subject in formal education. We don't anticipate too much of an increase in the use of English medium education at school level, although the starting age for studying English as a subject may get a bit older than it currently is in some places, but not all, given the evidence that we know exists on the advantages of mother tongue education. Studying face-to-face, as we said, in English-speaking countries will remain a popular option, but there will be an increased focus on using digital capabilities to give a wider range of people access to studying English. The concept of ELT as native speakers teaching a single standard form of English will continue to shift towards a more multilingual reality, with the acceptance of a range of different Englishes and the use of other languages in the classroom. English speakers will need to learn other languages in order to compete in more multilingual environments. And in some countries, particularly in post-colonial contexts, and in line with the broad movement to decolonize education and society, an emphasis on the importance of indigenous languages will move the focus away from English to an extent. As part of the shift towards more multilingual classrooms and acceptance of a range of Englishes, methods of assessment will also take more consideration of English as a global language, although native speaker norms will remain in some assessment contexts at least. EDI, equality, diversity, and inclusion, will become a significant focus in teaching, learning, and assessment. Two examples of this are the opening plenary at the IATEFL conference last year, which focused on inclusion, and the recent revision of the British Council's inclusion policy for our language centres, which is extremely detailed. It's nearly 100 pages long. This emphasis on EDI will be supported by increased learning online, although we have to acknowledge that many people are being excluded by the move online. So the use of digital and other technologies to increase access to learning will be vital. The emphasis on EDI will include assessment with alternative assessment methods focusing on English as a global language, despite some lingering of native speaker norms. Assessment will be more fully integrated into learning systems, and there will be a focus on the effective assessment of speaking and listening. EME, English medium education, will continue to thrive in higher education in many countries, but the focus in basic education will be on learning English as a subject, with increasing awareness that children need to learn a language that isn't their home language as a subject for several years before they can effectively be taught other subjects in that language. And in some contexts, at least, this will allow an expansion of basic education in students' home languages, particularly, we think, at primary level. And finally, English, or possibly Englishes, will continue as the main global lingua franca, including in higher education. But there will be an increasing awareness of, firstly, the importance of learning English as a subject sufficiently well before it's used as a medium of education. Secondly, the multilingual reality of many learners' and teachers' lives. And thirdly, the importance of indigenous languages. So after we made our predictions, we conducted a series of regional roundtables with policymakers and policy influencers around the world to get their views on our predictions and on the future of English. Now, we conducted a total of 14 roundtables in 49 countries and territories across the world, with a total of 92 policymakers and policy influencers taking part from a range of specialities. Many in education, of course, including government ministers and department heads, but also experts in other languages, research, international affairs, economics, sport, edtech, and other areas. One of the outcomes of those phase 2 roundtables was a realization that making specific predictions, like I've just shown you, is just too difficult and too unreliable. So we moved our focus away from specific predictions towards devising a set of themes and questions that we thought would be relevant to the future of English. And we'll be presenting those themes in our book, which I'll tell you about in a minute. We then moved to phase 3 of the project, where we initiated our long-term research agenda by awarding a number of research grants to UK universities who are partnering with researchers and research participants in many other countries. And the aims of these grants are to evaluate our key themes and questions, to develop methods for measuring and tracking them over time, and to look at their impact on EFL, particularly in relation to developments in technology. Now, we've awarded our initial research grants to 4 UK universities who will report in about 3 years' time. And this is the start of phase 3 of the project. And these 4 universities will collaborate with other academics and partners in 42 other countries, namely France, Germany, Spain, Italy, Poland, Russia, Turkey, Ukraine, Georgia, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Malaysia, Japan, China, Thailand, Indonesia, Bangladesh, India, Pakistan, Vietnam, Nepal, Myanmar, Mexico, Argentina, Cuba, Chile, Ecuador, Brazil, Nicaragua, Jamaica, Venezuela, Colombia, Egypt, Malawi, Tanzania, Nigeria, Kenya, Cameroon, Ghana, Sudan, South Africa, and Ethiopia. I used to be able to do that in one breath, but I'm getting too old. Now, as well as these research projects, we are currently writing a book discussing the future of English project to date. We're planning to publish that in April this year. It'll be freely available on our website for everybody to read and to download, and Mina will give you details of how to access that at the end of her presentation. And now I'm handing over to Mina.
Thank you very much, Steve. And hello, everyone from Malaysia. It's lovely to be talking to you. We're very excited. Okay, so in my part of the presentation, I'm going to focus on teachers and what the future of English might mean for them. So to do that, I'd like to talk about English language teaching before the COVID pandemic in a very, very general way, just to begin with, just to get us all on the same page. So let's start by looking at some of the resources teachers around the world use. So we, and I include myself, we use course books. Whether they are local or international, they provide the backbone of the majority of English language teaching around the world. Boards, be they black, white, or electronic, many, many teachers have access to some kind of board in the classroom. The internet. Increasingly, many teachers, even before the pandemic, turned to the internet for resources to complement their existing classroom practice. Computer labs. I know some of us might think they're a bit dated, but in some countries, computer labs are still used as a supplement to traditional classroom teaching for lessons. Tablets. Some countries are integrating the use of tablets into classrooms as they can be more cost effective and more flexible than computers or even laptops. And finally, mobile phones. More learners than ever before have mobile phones. Some teachers leverage on this as an additional resource. Now, this isn't a definitive list. It's just to get us in a general frame of mind of what teaching used to be like. So let's now talk about methodology pre-pandemic. Again, I'm talking very, very generally. So methodology can be teacher, learner, or learning-centered, or it can be a combination of all three. But if it's going to be a combination of all three, it depends on two things. One, the teacher, and two, the curriculum. I'm not going to go into details here because I think you can follow where I'm getting at, but we can have this discussion later. Methodology can be assessment orientated. Whether we like it or not, most methodology used in schools today is assessment oriented. Again, I know what I'm talking about. Pre-pandemic, most of us were used to and comfortable with face-to-face delivery and for face-to-face methodology. However, even pre-pandemic, there was some online teaching, whether it was fully online or whether it was blended, but perhaps not in mainstream education. So in terms of methodology, very vaguely, 4 very broad areas of what we covered pre-pandemic. Then the coronavirus pandemic came along. Who could have predicted it? Who would have thought that life as we knew it would change so much? But who can actually predict the future? Well, as we've just heard from Steve, David Gradol made a very good attempt at it. Steve also talked about the regional roundtables. We did one in the Americas, and I'd like to share with you some of the highlights from the Americas roundtables. Not details, but just some of the important things that came out from that roundtable discussion. The countries represented at the roundtable were Argentina, Brazil, Colombia, Mexico, and the USA. And I'm going to share with you 4 main things that came out from that discussion. Teachers and teacher education came out very strongly. Teachers are very important, but across the countries that represented, there were 2 concerns. The first concern was around not having enough English teachers. And the second was around the quantity and quality of training for English teachers. The second thing that came out quite strongly was equity and inclusion. And Steve touched on this as well. The countries represented had many similarities. They were all concerned about teachers and training. But there were also many disparities, both across the countries and within the countries. And these disparities, among many, included not having access to quality education and resources, and was sometimes exacerbated by the urban and rural divides. So disparities in terms of what some people had and what some people didn't have. And then employment was seen as a strong driver for learning English, particularly in the hospitality sector. And that was across most countries that were represented as well. And of course, technology, seen as an enabler for many and a disruptor for those who don't have access to it. Generally, the quality of provision using technology was questioned. So those that did have it were questioning the quality of the provision it provided, teachers provided. And participants stated quite strongly that technology shouldn't be defined too narrowly. And I think this is a really important point. Technology is not just about laptops and tablets and mobile phones, but in some contexts, it's about television and radio as well. But what does this all mean from an educational systemic perspective? the participants in the roundtable were talking about contexts they live in and systems they work in. The Comprehensive Learning System by Barry O'Sullivan proposes that for learning programs to function efficiently, they should be seen as one comprehensive system. Within the system, the three core elements, curriculum, delivery, and assessment, must be based on a single philosophy of learning that is supported by clearly defined models of language ability and progression and underpinned by a measurement model. Failure to ensure that all three work fully in harmony is likely to lead to a failure of the system. So if one of the components, curriculum, delivery, or assessment, is a little bit off kilter, then the system fails to function as it should do. But the system itself does not exist in a vacuum, but instead it is situated within a specific educational and social context, which is defined by key stakeholders who comprise that context. For us, teachers are considered key stakeholders. So if we take the data that we have collected so far from the 14 roundtables and think about a comprehensive learning system, what does that mean for teachers? Before we find out, I'm going to give you a couple of questions I'd just like you to think about. The questions are to do with teachers and teaching practice. They're for you to think about and perhaps discuss with your colleagues. And if you like, answer in the chat or comment in the chat. That would be great. So the first question is, has anything changed in English language teaching since the pandemic? So we all went online. Perhaps we didn't all go online, I don't know. But since we're coming back post-pandemic, what changes can you see? So have a think, and if you want to comment or ask a question, pop it in the chat. And then the second question is the one that you can see on your screen right now. The single biggest change to English language learning and teaching will be in the area of technology, equity of access, assessment, pedagogy, or something else. What do you think? So thinking about the future, where do you think English language learning and teaching will change? And we can discuss this in the Q&A. So I'm going to leave you these for now, and we'll come back to them later. So let's talk about English language teachers. Let's talk about you. All our data tells us that teachers are very much at the heart of the teaching and learning process and the system as a whole. Regardless of the mainly technological shifts during the pandemic, teachers still remain very important. However, in some places in the world, there are concerns about the capacity. Two questions are here. I've mentioned this already. Are there enough English teachers? And two, are there enough skilled English teachers? So that takes us back to the training element. Then there's technology. Is it a help or a hindrance? Do teachers like it? Can teachers exploit it effectively? Some countries are talking about AI, but what about those contexts that have limited or no access to technology at all? So if we go back to the question, can teachers exploit it effectively? Again, goes back to training and development. And finally, what are the implications of all of this for development and training? Well, in my opinion, the implications are considerable and multifaceted, and at all levels of the education system. The implications affect policy, institutions, and, of course, you, the individuals. These are very big questions, and as I said, the Future of English project doesn't claim to have all, if any, of the answers, but we do hope that it will help us in some way towards finding the answers. So, having talked about some implications for teachers, what are the factors that influence them? Policy decisions are a big factor. Decisions about the use and role of English, the curriculum, national assessments, materials, etc. These are the decisions that are out of our hands, but they nonetheless have an impact on what happens in the classroom. The learner. Earlier on, I asked what had changed post-pandemic. One answer is the learner. the learner has changed in different ways in different contexts. Generally, the learner is more aware of possibilities and opportunities, and the learner is more engaged. The learner is more present in the process. At least that's what the data tells us so far. There are other changes, but this is a big one. And of course, if the learner changes, so does what happens in the classroom. But for me, it's you, the teachers, that have the biggest influence on yourselves and what you do. I say this because regardless of all the external factors, regardless of all the policies in place or the resources you have or don't have, what you do in the classroom, and equally what you do not do, what you accept, what you change, what you reject, comes down to what you believe about teaching and learning and your own role within that. Our beliefs about education generally and the teaching and learning process and our professional development drive our practice and hopefully drive our development. Professional development can be institutional and driven by schools and governments, but it can also be personal, driven by our own interests and our desire to know more about a particular aspect of teaching and learning. In the previous slide, when I talked about the learner being one of the biggest changes, I wasn't just talking about students we teach. I was talking about ourselves as learners, taking ownership of what we want to learn, using our own agency to be better informed and improve our classroom practices to help optimize the teaching and learning experience. The three elements on the screen feed into each other, inform each other, and now more than ever, I think we should be asking ourselves, what do I believe about teaching and learning English? What are my principles around it? What is my role within the learning system? And how can I best achieve what I want, both for me and my students? It's about articulating or revisiting what we believe about what we do. It's about using our beliefs to review what we do in the classroom, and then using that review of our practice to take ownership of our development to drive our own change. So if you ask me what's in store for English teachers looking into the future, my answer is, it's you, the teachers, taking ownership of the importance that's been placed on you and having the confidence to be the change you want to see. And you can start this right now by having your say and participating in our Future of English survey for educators. You can just scan the QR code and it will take you straight to the survey. And if you'd like to know more about the project, you can visit the website, the URL's there. And finally, I know Steve's mentioned the book several times. A book about the project and its findings so far will be published in April this year. So please watch this space. In the meantime, thank you very much for your time, and I look forward to the Q&A session and talking to you about the content of this presentation. Thank you very much.